you have heard about this at book club already when we presented it this fall, but we have a special treat tonight, which is that Jim Barnier is able to be with us, the architect of the museum and its more recent addition, the Sculpture Garden. Hey, Donna Pickens.
Hello, coming in.
Welcome. And so we have our special guest here tonight, and Jim is going to share a lot about his point of view as an architect, but also as a lover of great books. And we're always so very happy when he is able to be with us at book club. So, what did you guys think of this book?
I loved it.
Why did you love it, Donna?
Well, we have family in Asheville, number one, and we've been to the Biltmore a number of times. And I was just fascinated with the history of the family. I really was.
It is certainly a very interesting book in terms of stories that we may not know about the house and the family's impact on the community, which is something Jim and I have certainly been talking about. Who else read the book and is willing to share your thoughts?
Am I in?
Yes, welcome.
Okay.
Hey,
Hi, Alice.
we're so happy.
I finally got in, honey. Okay.
Yay! Well, we can't have book club without you. So now I think we're ready. We were just asking everybody what they thought about the book. Would anyone else like to share anything? Donna said she loved it, loved hearing about the history, loved her own connection through family to the Asheville area and learning anything about it. Anybody else willing to share? All right, in that case, let's go ahead and get started.
Oops.
Okay, Alice, you want me to say anything to get started, or have you got it covered?
You go ahead. I've been talking a lot. Thank you.
This is a book, The Lice Castle, written by Denise Curran. I think that's the way you spell her name, pronounce her name. It was obviously on the New York Times bestseller list, and it was the second bestseller book that this author has written. Obviously, as an architect, I was attracted to the book strictly because of its subject matter, the Biltmore house and garden. I have fortunate enough to have been there several times, once as a child and probably shortly after it was built, and later as I took my own children. I found the book to be a saga of brute achievement, inspiring generosity, and unexpected and unlikely endurance. The unexpected part of the book was it's not just a book about the building of a great piece of architecture. It really is more of a as that said, a saga of the times. Mm-hmm. And the challenges that were faced both in the building of the house, then the keeping of the house, and the ensuring that the house would still be there for future generations. And that is the interesting part to me about it. And the other thing that she did such a good job of weaving into this saga is how the builder, and then later, and almost more so, Edith, his wife, changed the entire area in which they lived. They introduced forestry to America and to a great deal to the world. They introduced cottage industries. They introduced education to those who didn't have access to education. They introduced job procurement. They built a village that employed hundreds of people. So those were sort of the surprising things to me about the book. And with that, Alice, you want to start with some slides?
Sure. So
Everybody just chime in as you go through. This is a new experience for me to do a Zoom, and Alice and Brittany have been patient with me, teaching me how to do this. So if I all of a sudden go away, it's because I dropped something on my keyboard.
well, if we go away, I'm sure Brandy will be able to take it from here, who has helped us both so much today. Thank you so much, Brandy, always for your
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Club. So, you know, I agree with what Donna and Jim have said about this powerful story. And I think the writer's approach is really worth noting. And she's very clear on her website. She doesn't have a special topic she likes to write about. She likes good stories. And she writes for adults, she writes for children, she's written movie scripts. And I think she really captured the human interest in this book and the stories of survival and community that have been referenced. But she's written about women's issues, sports, food, travel, history for all kind of publications, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Village Voice, and on and on. And again, I think we can hear that journalistic voice, but just that voice that's interested in a great tale here.
And her first degree was in art.
And returning to this love of American art and architecture, and Jim, we just did a survey of the book club members, and American art was very, very popular amongst our group, which is great since we're an American art museum, but it's certainly a very, very important American house. So she does know a little bit about it after all, doesn't she?
The other thing I found interesting relative to the author and the book, by and large, the reviews were favorable, hence the bestseller. But as always, there are detractors. For example, one of the people that reviewed the book said he didn't know how anyone could write a book that was really interesting and really boring at the same time. But she managed to strike that balance. However, everyone said that it was one of the best researched pieces of writing that they had read, that she had done an exhaustive, extensive, and accurate, pass the fact check test, bit of research to put all of this together.
And so let's jump into her story. That is so well researched and that we can depend on. All right, back to you, Jim. Let's see if I can get the slide to advance. There you go.
Okay, this is the east facade. By the time you arrive at this view, looking down and across the esplanade, you have come down a 3-mile driveway that winds through the forest, designed totally by Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect, very famous landscape architect in America, Central Park. He actually did some work in Montgomery, did a lot of work in Atlanta. Anyway, he was the landscape genius behind this and the rest of the 125,000 acres. Think about that for a minute, 125,000 acres of the Biltmore estate. And he wanted this facade to come into view as a bit of a surprise. You had come through the woods with natural, unpruned, as he specified, foliage, and then you pop out into a very, very formal landscape situation. The house is a few interesting facts. It's 178,000 square feet. Some places they say 175,000, but the official Biltmore webpage says 178,000 square feet. To give you a quick comparison, the White House has 55,000 square feet. Mm-hmm. This house is over 3 times bigger than the White House. 125,000 acre estate is 3 times the size of Washington, D.C. And it was one couple's backyard. The ground floor, the main floor of the house covers 4 football fields. So it's an immense structure. Classically, the architectural style would be French Renaissance or inspired by French Renaissance chateaus. But as we come to America with that style, it's referred to as the chateau-esque architectural style. A created word, if you will, to express a form of architecture that was taken from the chateaus of France and in some cases England. The influence of this house is obviously the French chateau, Chambord, Chenonceau, and Bois. I think the stairway is almost a copy of the one at Chambord, but it's characterized by very steeply pitched roofs, turrets, a decorated rooftop. You can't see, and there's Wasden Manor on the right, and again that stairway, that tower stairway that circles up, moats, lots of windows. Originally, the Biltmore House had a very decorated roof line that was covered in gilt, and it had George Washington Vanderbilt's initials and family crest and so embossed on it.
And as Jim was saying, we're looking at this architect who drew on something as far back as the French Renaissance on the left, and something more recently, baronial house, Wasden Manor in England for the Rothschild families in the 19th century, but many influences, many sort of architectural quotes and inspirations, and as Jim said, building this American chateau. And I can certainly remember, as you were discussing, Jim, going as a child and being so blown away, but you wanted to bring us back to Montgomery and how this kind of influence and inspiration can be seen just driving down Perry Street.
The slide you see now is, anyone know where that is in the United States? It's on Perry Street, right here in Montgomery. It's the old Canty House, and it's the best, if not the only, piece of chateau-esque architecture in Montgomery. And it is or was built as a residence. It's built out of Indiana limestone, which is the same limestone that the Biltmore House was built out of. Most of the French chateaus were predominantly out of stone. And if you'll see, note the decorated dormers, the steeply pitched roofs, and so we in Montgomery have our own little Biltmore.
And getting back to the one in North Carolina, as you say, just imagining arriving through this sort of natural approach through the forest, not this on an axis, but all of a sudden this chateau-esque house or castle revealed with its limestone and its scale. You put it in relation to the White House and sort of dwarfing the White House, but at the same time, it would be dwarfed, say, by Buckingham Palace, about a fifth the size of Buckingham Palace. And, you know, we've got to think about sort of the constancy in human history. And certainly right now, a lot of peaceful protests around the world challenging racism, but also the inherent elitism and abuses of power that go with that. And there were a lot of critics at the time this house was built too, of its extravagance. And, you know, it's an enduring American architectural achievement and landscape achievement, and certainly a house that forever shaped the community in Western North Carolina where it's located, and many other advances in fields, including forestry and others. But there were critics at the time asking why did someone need a chateau like this?
Yeah, the house was started in 1898, I believe. Took 6 years to build it. It opened Christmas Eve, 1895. So wait a minute, no, I'm wrong on my dates. Anyway, it was 6 years and it opened on Christmas Eve, I think in 1898. The length from the right-hand side, which is the bachelor's wing, to the left-hand side, which is the library, is 375 feet. It's just an immense house, but at the same time, it's certainly not boring, and it is not repetitious. It has a great composition, I think. Certainly, it was an incredible undertaking. Some would say an extravagance, but it is an American achievement. It originally had, now mind you, it was opened in 1898. It was completely electrified. It had an Otis elevator, or maybe more than one. It had washing machines, and it was 30 years in America before people had washing machines. It had indoor swimming pool and an indoor 2-lane bowling alley. It was an engineering achievement as much as it was an architectural achievement. Back then, fires destroyed a lot of houses. It had a fire extinguishing system. The roof is steel framed, and each roof tile is wired directly to the steel frame with copper flashing around each roof tile. The house is divided into 6 sections with firewalls. So if there happened to be a fire, it would not consume the entire.
Oh, I want to mute this.
We might be picking up a little bit of background noise again.
Play that again.
I think we might be picking up a little background noise, but continue.
At my place or somebody else?
I don't think it's coming from us.
Okay.
So you were saying there are all of the inherent firewalls, the copper flashing on the roof, all of the unbelievable advances in engineering, and also just in modern conveniences, washing machine, etc.
Exactly. Like I said, it was an inventor, and he was a friend of Edison. It was an inventive as well as engineering feat equal to its architectural. Frankly, the architecture pulls from history, which a lot of good architecture does. The conveniences and advances of engineering were all brand new. So that may be the more inventive part of the house is its construction and the amenities that it offered.
Yes, it has this historic facade. It looks like it could be from another time, yet it's incredibly modern when you go inside. And, you know, you think about those 6 years that it was built that you mentioned, and the time it opened around Christmas. You know, the owner, when he began building, was around 30, moved in his mid-30s, and they did move in around Christmas, as we said. And the Biltmore continues to be incredibly popular at Christmas. They go to great lengths to decorate it, and it's the most popular time of year for people to visit. And here we're looking at the dining hall and the stairwell decorated for the holiday.
First dinner party was Christmas Eve, 1898, I believe, or 1895, one or the other. And it was held in this room on the left, which is the banquet hall. And my memory serves me, it's 42 feet wide and 72 feet long, with a 70-foot high vaulted ceiling. The table extends to seat 64. They only had 48 at the first meal. The interior walls of the house are masonry as well. In other words, there's not a lot of wood framing in the house, virtually none. As a matter of fact, Mr. Vanderbilt had his own brick manufacturing process during the building of the house that managed to turn out 32,000 bricks a week. It's just amazing what all went into the building of this house. He extended the railroad for 3 miles so that workers and materials could be brought to the site. But this banquet hall is with the Flemish tapestries and the vaulting and the detail. There's an organ, as you see up on the balcony in the back, there's a pipe organ. And then at the other end, behind us in the photograph, are 3 huge fireplaces. The house also had furnaces. It had steam heat throughout. With
Excuse me, go ahead. You're saying steam heat.
steam heat and hot water. 65 bathrooms, 35 bedrooms, not counting staff bedrooms.
Enormous. And I think that Christmas Eve dinner you were referring to was in 1895. I think they began construction in 1889 and then celebrated Christmas there in 1895.
Right, and they got married, I think, in 1898. That's what I was getting confused about.
You're right. And that he did move in as a bachelor.
Right.
It's quite the bachelor pad, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So when we think about the plan of the house, so much is organized around this winter court. And when we look at the floor plan, you know, Jim spoke a lot about the grounds and really, to me, visiting the Biltmore, exploring the grounds is the most fun. You can bring your dogs. They have a kennel where you can board your dogs when you want to go in the house. But the natural beauty that surrounds it and those blue mountains we were looking at on the first slide is just extraordinary. Everything's extraordinary. But here we see a little bit of nature brought inside that could be enjoyed year round. And light and art all combined in this space that's really the heart of the house.
This is, while it's very traditionally appointed, this winter garden was very popular during the Victorian era. During the Victorian era was the first time that American architecture made a concerted effort to extend the interior of a house to the exterior, to the site. And certainly at Biltmore with the gardens and the terraces and the vistas that happens, but also from an interior perspective because they were there a lot in the winter. So this is the winter garden. I think it's about 60 feet in diameter. The bronze statue is by Bitter. It's I think it's a boy stealing the geese or something like that. And it's just a wonderful space. If you've been to the house, it's light, it's airy, it keeps it from being dark and foreboding. A house of this scale and size could be. I think it's to me one of my favorite spaces in the house.
Absolutely. And then we see it there in the plan and in the first floor. It as such a great space or sort of the heart of the house as we've been discussing. And of course, the way the second and third floor and more of the private rooms are designed around it to allow for that natural light.
Yeah, as large as the house is, the plan is very well organized with vistas. You kind of always know where you are, particularly on the main floor, which was the public floor. And as Alice noted, the winter garden, which is that octagonal structure right dead in the center, is visible from every major space in the building. So you can always turn around and orient yourself to where you came in. The main front door is just to the left of the winter garden, that hall that goes all the way through. So I think it's a very well laid out floor plan.
And as you say, really taking advantage in so many places of the views beyond and all the different realms of the house. I mean, here we're looking at the library, certainly a very important room for a book club, but also to George Vanderbilt, who absolutely loved reading, and we can see the painting on the ceiling, the Chariot of Aurora or Dawn, and ideas of books, and books as new beginnings and daylight and learning and all that this room is meant to hold.
This was George Washington Vanderbilt's favorite room. I'm sure partly because he was an avid reader. Some writings of that period called him the best read man in America. He would read an average of 80 something books a year. The library is about, just the library room itself is about 2,400 square feet, a fairly decent sized house. As Alice mentioned, the ceiling was brought from Italy, the ceiling by Pellegrini, and I have read in some places that it's considered the best remaining of his work. It was in a palace in Venice. But I think the library has about 10,000 books from his personal collection. And it's, if you remember the floor plan, if you went in the front of the house, the winter garden was to your right, and this library space is the room that would be all the way to the end on the left. And outside the library is the grand terrace with the arbor, with the trumpet vine and wisteria growing on.
And then looking at bedrooms and going more deeply into the private space, we know that there were his and her rooms at the time this house was built, and this is his, I believe. Jim had a special interest in this room where
Go ahead.
This
is the Louis XV room, probably one of the most feminine and most decorated rooms in the house. And the presence of the baby bed is significant in the fact that this is where Cornelia was born, Edith and George Vanderbilt's only child, a daughter. And then Cornelia returned here to have her two children, two sons. She married a fellow named, I don't know if they pronounce it, Cecil or Cecil, from England. And there is Cornelia and Jack Cecil's children that are families who own the Biltmore and run it to this day.
And, you know, those curves that Jim mentioned, of course, when we're looking at Louis XV revival or Louis XV furniture, that is sort of the height of French Rococo, and seeing curves in wooden furniture, seeing curves in gilding on walls, that we don't see that here, but that light, feminine, free spirit that followed in France after the heaviness of Versailles and Louis XIV. And so what a great style for a room where two generations of the family, two women would choose to have their children. And can you imagine perhaps someone on this book club meeting but having a child in the room where you were born? It's pretty powerful.
Absolutely. And this is one of the last rooms. Well, I don't know what they've done. I hadn't been there in 7 or 8 years, but this room was fully restored to perfection, I think in the late 70s or early 80s. It was fairly late on the tour that this room could be viewed. Okay, this is in the basement. Actually, the house has a basement and a sub-basement. There's a basement under the basement. Considered one of the largest basements certainly of any kind of residential structure in America. It's a 70,000 gallon heated swimming pool, 70,000 gallons heated. And as you see, if it had water in it, there are electric underwater lights. Now, electric underwater lights in the 1890s, that is cutting edge. That is cutting edge technology. The entire room is tiled, and while these tiles look, fairly normal, there's nothing terribly exceptional about the tile, except that their age, they're still in perfect shape. They were done by a wonderful Spanish architect and engineer named Rafael Gustavino. He is kind of known as the architect behind the architect. He was a ceramic inventor and installer. He did things like the ceilings of the Grand Central Terminal in New York, a lot of the ceilings in the National Cathedral in Washington. He was just an incredible, and his probably strongest invention was a self-supporting ceramic tile vaulted ceiling. In other words, the tiles would rest on the tile before them and transfer the load all the way to the ground. And then they were beautifully decorated. While this is all white because it's a swimming pool, but there are other areas in the house, both interior and exterior, that had Gustavino tiles. There are also some at some of the areas in the vaulted areas in the All Souls Church, which was the Episcopal Church in the Biltmore Village.
And we don't have a picture of that bowling alley that you mentioned, but I think especially for young visitors, when you go to the Biltmore and think about, as you said, having a lit indoor swimming pool this long ago, or having a bowling alley in your house, it just really makes an impression, though I'm sure that different rooms and aspects of the house have made lots of impressions on everybody here. Is anybody willing to share when you have visited the Biltmore, what has really struck you? What about you, Brandy? Have you ever been?
I was afraid you were going to ask. Unfortunately, I have not been to the Biltmore.
Not yet.
Not yet, exactly, not yet.
And we'll see what your impressions are and get back to us.
That's right.
Put it on your list, because it is a self-sufficient estate, which was what George Washington Vanderbilt had intended to build to begin with. He was just, I think, a little ahead of his time. The house did not turn a profit until the 1980s. It is totally privately owned. It takes no federal funds, no grants, and receives no special tax benefits other than what would be normally given to a working agricultural for the farm acre. Originally, the 125,000 acres a lot of it has been sold off, and that's how they made it through the Depression. But it was sold to the government with the proviso that it would be the Pisgah National Forest, which was, again, George Vanderbilt's wish that it never be developed. And this is All Saints, All Souls Church.
That church that Jim mentioned that Richard Morris Hunt designed, and he only designed 6 churches in his lifetime. And this one on the Biltmore estate is the only one of those 6 that survives. So,
Wow.
yes, I would love to see it. I'm just like Brandy. I've got that on my list too to go to the church.
Now, where is that on the estate? Where is that?
I don't know.
Huh?
We'll have to go find it.
I guess so.
Seems to be a hidden treasure. And we're looking at the round arches, that Romanesque style that Jim referred to, the parish house there in the corner, and all of this built sort of simultaneously.
And I think it's interesting, while it doesn't clash with the Biltmore house, it is more of the scale and the texture and the feeling of a village church. It's not particularly grand, it's beautiful, but it is not a foreboding edifice, if you will. It's not a little cathedral.
Very charming, right?
It is very charming.
And then
There's a lot of walking to do there.
yes.
Lots of you were asking, my big thing was the library, because
Good.
if I understand it correctly, behind or on the top floor, the guests could sneak into the library from their bedrooms to come down and get a book.
Yes. I was thinking about that too when we were looking at the library, how you could slip in from the top floor.
That was
Exactly.
really impressive to me. I would love that.
So much fun. And again, showing that love of the library. And if we go back to the church for just a minute, if we think about how much George Vanderbilt loves his architect too, which is something that Jim and I have been talking about today, he also dedicated a stained glass window in Richard Morris Hunt's memory here. It's sort of the age of Tiffany, but different maker. And then jumping into a completely different direction, there was this school of forestry that Jim alluded to that was headquartered in this building.
One of the things I found most interesting was that the power for buildings, whether AC or DC, had not been established when this was designed. So they wired the entire building of the main home for both AC and DC.
Right.
It was one of those things that if you go on the really extended tour, they take you behind the scenes and show you things like that.
Yeah, the original electrical panel was 9 feet tall and 17 feet wide. You know, it was huge, and it, as was noted there, it was DC and AC, and it started out one and got converted to the other later on, I think. Took, and I mentioned steam heat earlier, had these great furnaces in the basement, boilers, and on a really cold spell in December, they would burn 25 tons of coal every 2 weeks.
Wow. Well, again, thanks for jumping in with those memories of the library and thinking about the complexity of figuring out electricity in the early days. And then, does anybody else have anything else to share about impressions before we go ahead into the forestry school?
Alice, I just wanted to say a recent trip that I made there, we went to the botanical gardens. Oh, can you hear?
Yes, you went to the botanical gardens?
And I had never been there before, and that's pretty phenomenal too.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
early on, propagation of plants and the reforestation of the area that's now the Pisgah National Forest was an early focus. This land was not attractive when he started buying it up. There was a guy named Chauncey Beadle who was his horticulturist, and he documents that they planted over 3 million plants in and around the house and in the forest.
which is a great segue to this building we're looking at, the Forestry School. And you've already kind of talked about the international impact and all of that going on in an area that, as you said, really hadn't been considered the most richly beautiful and needed to be sort of revived. And great story. Oh, there's our windows. Other impact, the Biltmore Industries. Here's a walnut piece that was made there. I just happened to see it came up at Brunk Auctions in Asheville. But again, this devotion to craft and craftsmanship, the creation of beautiful objects.
Another of their industries centered around the design and manufacture of fabrics.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm not mistaken, to this day, some of the designs and fabrics that this is something Edith Vanderbilt was particularly interested in, because it was employment that was available to women and women who could do that kind of work. And the fabrics are considered just works of art.
Absolutely. And that devotion to community and wanting to employ more people in making beautiful things, just like these two men who we've been talking about so much on a grander scale, whether we're thinking about women designing beautiful textiles or the landscape architect and the architect that we see here. Again, that George Vanderbilt loved so very much. He had the stained glass window commissioned for Hunt and the church Hunt design. He had these portraits of Hunt and Olmsted painted by John Singer Sargent, the great society portrait painter of the day, whether he would have been preferring to paint something other than society or not. But he's really rendered these two men. And again, when we think about kind of the state of actual plant life at the time that Jim was talking about, this is a bit imagined, all of the lush green around Olmsted, but you can see he's there on his cane and he's tired, though. This was actually very near the end of Hunt's life as well.
Right.
He appears a bit bolder in his stance.
Well, I think it shows a great deal of George Washington Vanderbilt's character and appreciation that he would commission that quality of artists to do and give credit to the creators of his masterpiece. Certainly hasn't happened to me yet, but I can applaud him for putting their names and their portraits out, so forever they got their share of credit for what they did.
Absolutely. And we have some more art slides to look at. I don't want to take too much time because I know that you all have things to do tonight, and we are all spending a lot of time on computer screens these days. So I'm going to just look quickly at a few paintings and then hand it back to Jim to sort of conclude with the impact of the family in the area and any other comments that you all might have. But if we look at, this is the World's Columbian Exposition. This is another of Hunt's great masterpieces in Chicago, much like we were referring to Olmsted's work in Central Park. This is the Marble Twins, another one of the Vanderbilt houses in New York, to give you a sense of where they lived when in the big city and not in the South. But looking at some of those paintings we mentioned, here we can see Sargent's portrait of Vanderbilt. Above all, Jim, what would you say he wanted to capture in this portrait?
Well, obviously, George Washington Vanderbilt was a very person, and the book certainly signifies that he was an avid reader. Interestingly enough, I don't know if all of you picked it up as you read the book. There's really not a lot about George Washington Vanderbilt in the book, and that is because he did not keep any of his letters or any of his writings to amount to anything. And neither did Edith. Edith's family burned all their family papers when her mother died. She was an orphan, and they burned them in the backyard of her grandmother's house. And obviously before electronic communication, there's not a lot known about George Washington Vanderbilt. And I think this portrait, along with the Whistler portrait, expresses that. He's pensive, but you just don't really know quite what he's thinking.
Kind of captures his personal elegance, much like our sergeant there. Speaking of Whistler, here is a Whistler painting of Edith on the right, and another portrait of her on the left. And she is really sort of the heroine of the book, and goes to such great lengths to save the house, to keep it going, to preserve the legacy. And there is the Whistler portrait that Jim referred to. And again, it seems that there's that thoughtful position, but also this real aristocratic look, as well as that self-portrait by Whistler that Vanderbilt was so keen to have, and just to have Whistlers in his collection. We have a few Whistler's prints here from our collection. The museum has a nice Whistler print collection.
Edith gave that Whistler to the National Gallery, or left it upon. It was already there, but when she died, she left it there permanently.
Yes, and then thinking about the other ways in which Asheville was growing around the same time, the Grove Park Inn, another just absolute favorite in Asheville. And then I know that this was one of Jim's favorite uses of the Biltmore. What's going on here, Jim?
Well, I mentioned earlier that the Biltmore house, as far as construction would allow then, and possibly even now, fireproof. And it was obviously very strong. So during the Second World War, many of the treasures in our nation's capital, art treasures, were stored at Biltmore House. They were stored in the ground floor kitchen, and in the music room, which is the room at the end of the grand entrance hall as you come in, was not finished until the 1980s. It was never finished during any of the original Vanderbilt's lives. So it was a relatively empty room, and so the things were stored there until late in 1944, when they were fairly sure Washington wouldn't be bombed.
So just a fascinating use. And then getting back to this idea that Jim brought up of art that was given by the family in that case also to the National Gallery. But Jim, I know you had a passage that you wanted to conclude with.
Yeah, just as I started my opening comments, the great surprise, and a pleasant surprise for me, was one, the strong role that Edith Vanderbilt, it was not her dream, it was his dream. It was already built before they got married. Is the strong role that she had in carrying on the legacy of the Biltmore. George Washington Vanderbilt died very suddenly in 1914 from complications from an emergency appendectomy. Edith, his wife, lived on until 1958. So she is the one that we should give credit to for saving the Biltmore House. As we know, so many architectural treasures in America have fallen to the wrecking ball, or to the hotel developer, or to whatever reason, fire. And it's just, I think, a wonderful addition to our collection of American architecture that this house makes. As this passage from toward the end of the book states, Edith's legacy is difficult to quantify, though her impact on the lives of those less fortunate than her from literacy students at the Moonlight School she established at the dairy to young students at the School of Domestic Service, likely has affected generations in the community of Georgia's Dream. Perhaps a wildly misguided one, but a masterpiece nonetheless. Had faced demise on countless occasions, Edith had been there to protect not just the structure and its entire contents, but a truly irreplaceable icon of an era of American history. She now left her grandsons with big shoes to fill, as there were few examples in America of how to make this kind of preservation, that of a private home, a successful venture. She may not have realized it at the time, but all her efforts to keep Biltmore House intact while selling off the village and the other immediate acres and investments achieved something that she never likely predicted. She changed the course of her family's future. And though what she had added, but rather not through what she had sold, but rather with what she bought in the process, time. So I think she's the one we should give credit to.
Absolutely. Really, as you said, kept that vision alive of the house and survived so much hurricanes and everything else that we read about. Does anybody have any final comments before we close for the evening?
Thank you.
Thank
Well,
you.
that was wonderful.
Thank you.
I was there once
Yes. Thank you.
many years ago, and this brings back just wonderful memories when I was there, and the enormity and the grandeur and just the breathtaking vistas alone. And there's just, it was too much to take in for the day. And I'm going to go back, especially now, and read the book. I must read the book now.
It is
Thank
a
you
good
so
book.
much.
The book is good. Read the book.
Really is good.
And we do thank you all for coming. And if there's not a final comment, I do have a final question, which is, of course, we don't know when the museum will reopen, but Jim designed our museum, and again, more recently, it's Sculpture Garden. Jim, when the museum is able to reopen, what do you hope it will be for Montgomery and her citizens to be able to come back to the museum?
Well, I'll zero in on just the garden at this point, because we've all had the museum building, collection, and staff as part of our lives for many years at this point. But the garden is relatively new, and it's so unfortunate that in its youth, we had to sort of abandon her. While this garden is 2.5 acres, it's not 125,000 acres. I think it has some of the guidelines that Olmsted would have approved. You walk through the main entrance gates. In other words, you do have a portal. I think it's very important that when you arrive at a special place, you know that you have arrived. And that one of the psychologists tell us one of the most impacting human experiences is walking through a portal. Water and fire are the other two. But walking through a portal is very impactful to we human. And then as the garden unfolds, you get to discover things. You get to discover certainly the sculpture that it's exhibited there, or you might get to discover a nice cocktail party that's going on, or a wonderful wedding that's going on. And as you travel the path down toward the museum, all of a sudden you get the introduction of a water feature. I think the reflecting pool, that's the second thing that impacts people. We don't have fire out there yet, but we have portal and we have water. The 130-something foot reflecting pool, I think is a feature that would encourage people, I hope, to enjoy themselves. one, whether it be to come read a book at lunch, whether it be to meet a friend at work, to look at the sculpture, whether it be to attend an event. And it doesn't really matter what season it is. The garden puts on different clothes for different seasons. In the winter, it's kind of clad in pale grays and maybe cloud-covered skies. And then in the summer and spring, it's awash with color. So my hope is that people would just enjoy it. And as you do when you go to the Biltmore House, everybody takes away their own special memory.
And such a great respite for people. And again, whenever the museum is able to open again, a place in the museum where people will certainly feel safer, being outdoors and being able to reflect and enjoy art in that setting. So we're so glad that we have it for when we are able to return.
And it follows a great legacy of our museum in that education is part of the focus. And not just education of adults, or not just education of young people, or not just, but it includes children. And I think a garden is a place that children might be a little more comfortable than any other place. And what better way to introduce a young child to the world of museums than through a pleasant afternoon in the park.
In an art gallery that, as you said, changes with every minute, hour, day, month,
yeah,
and season.
exactly.
So, well, everyone, thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight. Jim, a special thank you for this gift of speaking to our book club tonight. Thank you.
Well, anytime you get hard up, just call me.
Oh,
You know we will. We're already about to start looking at the books for next year.
Good. I enjoyed it. Thank all of you for your attention.
thank you, Jim. Thank you, Alice. Thank you,
Thank you.
Brandy.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.